I had a challenging relationship with my father, and I didn't go through great physical abuse, but arguably they were easier to deal with than because with the emotional stuff you never really knew where you stood. And I think that was another reason behind my addiction, in that I could never accept myself as that. I was always trying to be something else, but different. And I picked that drink up, I did what I did, and what I knew would happen did happen. The locks were changed in the house and I wasn't allowed anywhere near it, and rightly so. And,
but you did face it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But I phoned them back up and I asked for help. I said, I need help.
It's not Pop Tuesday, time to refresh for business creativity and living your
John, thank you so much for being here with me in studio today. I'm very excited for you to share your story of your journey through addiction and where you started, how you worked through it, and all the wonderful things that you're doing now and how you're helping men. So if we can dive into your personal story, and if you want to take us back to the beginning of kind of where that addiction first started and how it kind of got out of control.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me as well. So I guess going right back, I started out life as I don't know, what would you say, like a typical little boy in a family in Surrey, and there was problems in the house and everything, and my dad was a particularly stern character, this sort of thing. I just remember from a really young age, and I'm not on my own with this, I get, all kids are kind of frightened, but I remember predominantly being particularly the feeling of fear and insecurity, and kind of I was certainly frightened of my dad. I was really scared of my dad, and it was quite a turbulent environment at home. There was a lot of arguing and quite an oppressive atmosphere where we had to walk around like on eggshells. We didn't want to upset my dad, in other words, because he would just sort of go, and we were scared of that. So we learned to just almost manage that situation from the word go. So I was a really sensitive little boy as well. I was so sensitive. It was literally painful. Do you know what I mean? It was absolutely painful, and of course I couldn't speak. I couldn't say anything about that because, number one, I guess I didn't know how you conveyed that. But I wouldn't. We were, I guess, encouraged to not talk about how we felt. We weren't. If we cried, we were sort of shouted at, that sort of thing, and expressed how we felt and whatnot. So it was I'm not going to sit here and say it was the worst childhood ever, because by far it wasn't, but it wasn't the best, and I had a mum who was just an amazing woman, doing the absolute best she could in that, and I knew, I got so much love from my mum, which was amazing, and I don't know where I'd have been without that, and I still count that as an absolute blessing. Do you know what I mean? She was like my hero in a sense, and so I had this sort of uncomfortability about myself right from the word go. Felt really awkward and like never fitted in, and felt like I wanted to be part of this lot and this lot and this lot, and I guess I never really felt like I did. And
was that in your school kind of environment with your friends and peers?
Yeah, everywhere really. Yeah. I felt awkward, even around my family and cousins and stuff like that. I always felt less. I suppose the feeling was of less than. I kind of felt less than, and I'm saying this only from what I remember, and I'm sure it probably wasn't all like that, but they're the predominant kind of memories that stick with me. And as life sort of progressed and I got older and older, the fear didn't really subside. If anything, it got worse, because sort of teenage years were looming, this, that and the other. And I picked up some really strange behaviours before I picked up a drink. I used to steal from shops. I used to go in and steal things, and I was someone who was terrified of authority. I was petrified, and so it doesn't make sense. But it wasn't like I was getting a thrill out of, like, I didn't care, or it was some sort of, I don't know. I was terrified doing it, yet I'd still go and do it, and I couldn't even understand why I was doing it, and I didn't know what some sort of form of escapism, and I got a bit hooked on looking at magazines that little boys shouldn't probably be looking at, and I got lost in that world. And so from a young age I was learning to escape. I picked up habits like picking my fingers and tapping all the time, and from a really young age, and I kind of believe I'm not going to put a label on myself as ADHD, but my mind almost learned to distract itself from quite a painful reality, I can now see. And But when the age of like 13, 14 came, and girls were happening and parties and all this, and I desperately wanted to be part of it all, and I was just terrified. I was absolutely terrified. I didn't think.
Was it like a social anxiety, or just when you were with people, how you felt kind of in your general
I think,
day to day?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know if I can narrow that down to any one thing. I think there was I often say that my alcoholism was about me. It was rooted in fear. So it was rooted in fear, my addiction, and it seemingly became the antidote to that fear because of what it did to me internally, and how it changed my worldview when I drank and did certain things. And I don't know if I can really narrow that down to any one thing. It seemed to sort of manifest in different areas. I was certainly scared of my father, and perhaps as a result I was scared of men. I found it really difficult to form relationships with men. I found it a lot easier to be around girls, and at that age it was girls, so I would find myself around it because I sort of knew that, and I suppose I felt safer. I wasn't ever particularly the alpha male type lad who would scrap and all that sort of thing, and I didn't like that about myself either. So there were all these things. It was all negative, and to cut a really long story short, I drank alcohol, and it changed all that. It seemed to. There's a phrase that's used. It says that it filled the hole in the soul. It kind of made me feel complete, and it, in many ways, it did. It gave me this confidence I never had before. It kind of turned me from this scared little mouse in the corner to this kind of creature like prowling. I just sort of brought me alive. I thought I just completely came alive when I drank alcohol. And from the word go, I just loved it. I loved the effect it had on me. And it became like the key to this new way of being. And there's this sort of debate whether you drink yourself into alcohol dependency or alcoholism, or whether it's environmental, whether it's genetic, blah blah blah. But my experience, I feel like I was an alcoholic waiting to pick a drink up. I picked the drink up, and it just took me because of the effect it had on me. And I don't know if they're on a physical dependence formed or what it was, but I just know I was hooked. I was definitely hooked on the feeling it gave me when I drank.
And was that from 13, 14?
Yeah. And my first drinking experiences were not pretty. I went to a youth club party, one of my first experiences, and my mum, I sort of wrapped my mum around my little finger and got this litre bottle of Cinzano, and I just I drank it like fruit juice on the way to this party, and I never even made it to the party. I just in an alleyway covered in crap and just didn't even get there. And this is 13, 14 years old. I was throwing up, and the weird thing is I couldn't wait to do it again. I felt terrible, but that sense of just, and also it was like this weird knowing that I sort of knew what alcohol would do. It was like I sort of knew that it would, and I don't know where I got that from, but so anyway, that was about as glamorous as it got. It was a social lubricant. I had a challenging relationship with my father, and in as much as I loved him to bits, and I idolised him, but at times I hated him. I was just torn apart by this kind of what's the word for it? Where there's a paradox. This man who's my hero, but is almost evil at times towards my mum and me and my sister, and
just to understand kind of maybe your father and what that relationship was like, just so maybe there's people that can really relate. Was it more of like emotional abuse or physical, or because some people don't realize maybe that the emotional stuff can be just as damaging as physical. It doesn't always have to be a physical thing. How did you experience that relationship?
It was definitely I would suggest more emotional than physical. There were physical moments, but they were they came and went, but it was, and arguably, I mean, I didn't go through great physical abuse, but arguably they were easier to deal with than because with the emotional stuff, you never really knew where you stood. You never really, if it was a physical outburst, you kind of, I know where I'm at now, and then it was done and done. But with the other stuff, it was just I can only explain it as like walking around with this sense of oppression and the heaviness everywhere and fear. You're walking around in fear, Perhaps that's where partly my sensitivity comes from, because I had to learn from a very, very young age how to read a situation, to be very alert. And they say, don't they, that people who suffer abuse become hypervigilant because it becomes a coping mechanism to deal with the environment they're in. And I certainly have traits of that. And I almost feel like I was kind of born like it anyway, in a way.
Some people just are naturally, we've got more sensitivity or tenderness, than other temperaments. Yeah, so, absolutely. Yeah. And I know I probably have how do you say? I have that side of me is quite prevalent in me. I'm quite in touch with feelings, emotions, all that sort of thing. Which as a teenage boy who's trying to be a lad and whatever I was trying to be. It's not a good look. Yeah.
It's like, all the lads are like, well, we're about fighting and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like this, like, no, I don't, like, just no. I couldn't do that stuff. But I saw it as a massive negative. And I think that was another reason but another dynamic of my addiction, in that I could never accept myself as that. I was always trying to be something else for different people. And, for 1 minute I was out, sort of with my mates, trying to be some plastic gangster, and they're all behind me so I can act up and everything. And then the next minute I was at the golf club with my dad, which is very, very posh, well-to-do golf club in Surrey, where you have to wear collars and everything. Trying to be the dutiful son and in the golf club, and
that's exhausting all these, in itself, isn't it? Trying to be the different things for different people.
A chameleon.
Wow. And so where did that then start to escalate into realizing that you needed to get some kind of support and sort yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of hit the ground running with that, and I got sober when I was 29 years old, but it quickly escalated. I mean, I was drinking daily by the time I was 17. I just would drink whenever I could, and the dilemma of addiction is that the more I used the substance that I thought was kind of fixing me, the more consequences it created, the more separation I experienced from others and relationships and actually myself. I now realise, looking back, that almost as soon as I started drinking, I started to become disconnected from who I truly am. And it was a really recovery, in a sense, has been a reconnection with that self, or a uncovering of my true self, if you like. And for me it's been in a spiritual way as well. So the consequences got worse as time went on, and as I was meant to be growing up, my pals and my peers were buying houses and getting married, and I was sort of getting left behind and couldn't really understand why I couldn't get a grip on anything, or couldn't hold a relationship down, or a job, or somewhere to live, and blah blah blah. I just couldn't. Life seemed to be like trying to hold sand in your hands. It just all slipped past me. I just couldn't get a grip on anything, and but never once blamed the alcohol, or
you didn't see it as the alcohol.
No, alcohol was always the solution. Alcohol was, but the lie was that alcohol was the escape from the inability to do that or be that, and the fear that produced. So it was again
a circle, isn't it?
Exactly. And the more you feed it, the worse the consequences get, and the more disconnected you become. And it's got you, and it's got you way before you realise it's got you as well. And I was making decisions that I knew in my heart were wrong. So my heart's telling me one thing. I was like, and the pinnacle of that, I suppose, was when my son was born, and I was already just well gone into it. And I'd done a home detox. I'd done a home detox when my mum literally had to come and look after me while I detoxed off the alcohol. Before my son was going to be born, and so ultimately the most important thing in my life is about to happen, and the reality was that completely spun my head out. I had no tools to deal with. I couldn't look after myself, let alone believe I could look after a child. But every part of my body is screaming out, saying, come on, you've got to step up, you've got to be a man, you've got to do this. And the reality was I had no chance. And
did you have anyone from the outside saying these things to you, or pointing things out?
Yeah, well, I guess so, ish. But I would choose my audience wisely. If I started to hear things I didn't want to hear, I would often swerve away from them. And my mum, bless her, she lived up in Suffolk at the time. My dad he was living over, so my dad would get a call for help often, and one time I remember just before my son was born, I sat with my dad in a pub, obviously, because I couldn't talk to my dad without a drink. And I remember saying to my dad at the bar, I said, Dad, you know, you're going to be a granddad, and I had to break the news to him. And I remember saying to him the words like, it's going to be okay. I looked at him and I said, it's going to be okay. And I knew he knew it wasn't. You know what I mean? It was just a complete lie. It was a lie. I mean, ultimately, actually, it was, because that my son coming along really was the catalyst to my rock bottom, which then led me into recovery. So in a back to front way, it was okay. But from the positioning I was then, I didn't have any idea that it was going to be okay. And actually, I didn't believe it was going to be. I was just hoping it would be, you know, and just inside it was just. But I remember that, and I'd seen that look in my dad's eyes a number of times when he's just looking at his son, thinking, I have no idea what to do with you. I have no idea, and it's horrible to see that, because you can fit your heart screaming out, going, "What are you doing? What are you doing? You're hurting these people around you." And my sister bore the brunt of it mostly, probably. Well, not probably, she did. Bless her. And yeah, so yeah, I ended up this guy at 29 who was so far removed from who I really am. And the baffling thing was, I got to that place, and if you'd have sat me down and said, John, how did you get there? I wouldn't have been able to tell you. I seriously, genuinely would have had no idea.
Wow.
Yeah, I could have told you I drank too much, but that would have been it.
Yeah,
I said, other than that, I have no idea.
Yeah, just so disassociated from life, yourself.
Yeah.
Just, yeah.
Yeah. And in a way, that was the goal, right? That was the goal from this not perceived, it was a painful reality.
Yeah.
I mean, and everyone deals with pain, right? I'm not saying there's nothing unique about me at all. My way of handling it was the problem, in a sense, you know, and perhaps there's evidence of how we're genetically wired up, all that sort of thing. But yeah, it was the goal was a disconnection from reality, because I found reality very painful. Yeah. And of course, I made it really, really painful. Gosh, you know, you do the one thing you desperately don't want, you end up creating. Wow. Again, that's the nature of addiction. Wow. I believe.
So how did that journey to recovery and sobriety look?
Yeah, so it came to a crunch when my son was born, and I was dry when he was born, and I'm going to make a definition between being dry and being sober, because if you take away the substance or the liquid, whatever it is from an alcoholic or an addict, you're still left with that person. You're left with it. Arguably, it's worse for the person, because you're kind of taking away the rock that they used to hide under. Yeah. And it's like what is?
Yeah, and there's a lot to face. Yeah. Then, isn't there?
Yeah. So I get why people don't get sober or get recovery. So Jack was born, and then we got him back to the house, and I didn't get any help through that process. And that's a lie. I got help for the detox and this, that, and the other. And it was a really difficult time, and I guess there's no other way of putting it. Is I couldn't handle the responsibility. I was terrified of being a dad, of being a man, stepping up, and in reality, I was still a 13-year-old little boy who'd picked up a drink. I hadn't grown emotionally. I hadn't taken responsibility for barely anything in my life. It was all an avoidance, so I got to this age with a baby boy, and I just crumbled, and I picked another drink up. I picked a drink up when he was must have been a month, 6 weeks old, something like that, and that was one of my moments in a 12-step fellowship I go to still. There's step one is. Says we were powerless over alcohol, and our lives became unmanageable. And this moment when I walked into this off license, and I was heading for the counter to buy a bottle of vodka, and my son was in the house down the road, and I knew, every part of my body knew what, if I drank this bottle, knew what would happen. There was no gambling or no maybes. I knew exactly what was going to happen. That's it. Thank you. The consequences. And I still went down that. And that was another heart moment of almost seeing yourself in third person, saying, "What are you doing? This is insanity."
The power of that internal drive and the addiction, because even though you know what's right and what's wrong, it's almost just overpowering, isn't it?
And it destroys you. And the reality is, it actually needed to destroy me. Those actions,
rock bottom.
exactly, those actions. Wow. And I picked that drink up. I did what I did, and then I knew what I knew would happen did happen. The locks were changed in the house, and I wasn't allowed anywhere near it, and rightly so. You know, I wasn't safe to be around a newborn child, and so I ended up on my own, on my arse, pushed everybody I'd pushed away. And the sort of the, for me, it was a real, in a sense, it was a God moment where there was nowhere left to point the finger. There was nobody left to blame. Not that I wasn't a great blamer of other people anyway, but there was no more justifying. I was just on my own, done, you know. And I know I often say that it was the darkest moment in my life, but it was the biggest gift in my life. Because if that moment hadn't happened, I believe I'd never have found recovery, and I wouldn't have had the amazing life I've had, you know, as a result of that moment. Literally that one moment where I, in desperation, I don't know if I had faith at that time or whatever, but I know I just became willing to do whatever it took. And I didn't know what that meant at the time. I didn't know what that looked like. I had no idea. I had no idea how I was going to climb this mountain of shit that created, excuse my French, but chaos and harm, and again, I understand why people don't get sober. It's like this stuff is like this massive rucksack full of consequences.
Too much to face.
It's too much to surmount, you know, and you and
but you did face it.
Yes, absolutely, and that moment led to me somehow picking the phone up. I'd been under the mental health team in Chertsey, St Peter's Hospital. I've been under them for some time, where, you know, sporadically, and I never really turned up, and I turned up drunk, and it was all messy. But I phoned them back up, and I asked for help. I said, I need help. And I think before, when I'd done it, it was a little bit under duress, because my partner was pregnant and we were having a baby, and it was like, this is what I should be doing. That moment, I know I want to, and it's not even a case of need to. It was I want, you know, and I desperately didn't want to be the man I've become, because there was in my heart I knew I wasn't that person, and in my heart I know I had love in here and I had all this, you know, but it's like I couldn't get to it.
Wow.
Like I couldn't get to it. I was powerless over that. It was, but I often see it as a little pilot light left on. There was a little pilot light still in there that I think for me God come and just ignited that pilot light and said, you know, it was something came from somewhere where I just turned away from that way, and I didn't know what I was turning into, but I was willing to turn into whatever it was and do whatever it took to not be that man. And it has been all about not drinking and not taking drugs and not behaving certain ways, but it's got very little to do with the substances and behaviours.
Yes, it's always the things underneath, isn't it?
100%, yeah.
The things driving the behaviours.
Yeah.
So did you then, through the recovery, did you get a counsellor or someone to help unpack the things lying underneath to understand yourself better? So it started, it was a slow, well actually sometimes not so slow, but I ended up, through that phone call, I ended up getting and this is where I believe for me, God laid out, he absolutely laid out my recovery in front of me. It was almost like a carpet went, and my job was to just take one step at a time along that new way, or often which I couldn't see very far in front, or, you know, any far at all at the times. But I ended up in a treatment facility, and it was scary. It was like I didn't know how I'd ended up there. Like I said, I walked up to the doors of that place thinking, how did this happen? You know, how did this even happen? And they were great there. They were amazing. We did certain groups and things like this. And I was also around people who I kind of knew they understood me. I knew they knew where I was at. And the cherry on the cake was the 12-step fellowship came in and did these meetings in the treatment place. And I remember looking at these people coming in, like sort of coming into the lounge that we had that we'd sit in, and I don't know, we were told they were coming in, and we were told they were from this
organisation, and I looked at them thinking, there's absolutely no way on earth they're alcoholics. You know what I mean? They were just like, they came bouncing in the room, they're smiling, they're chatting, and I'm like, that is not how I feel. That's like, you know what I mean? That's not who I am. And you know, this beautiful lady Jill, who her nickname was Piano Teacher Jill. So you can imagine how very prim and proper. And I'm like, there's no way she's an alcoholic. But she sat down and started sharing her experience. I was like that. My chin was on the floor. It's like, oh my goodness, she's just me in a different physical form. Wow. From a different little bit of time, but different. All the physical manifestations were different, but she'd gone through the same stuff. Wow. Fear, insecurity, didn't want to be who she was. It was all, you know, all that stuff, and yeah, it was crazy. And I identified with these people so strongly. I knew that was going to be the way for me to go. And again, it was another, you know, coincidence, but because I'd drunk myself, technically homeless, I got a place in a dry house over in Farnham, and so I'm just coming up 30 years old, and I'm in this piddly little room with a fridge buzzing away in the corner. It's a hostel, really, dry house hostel. Thinking, on the one hand, how did this happen? On the other hand, but there was this overarching sense of, this is where you need to be. You need to be here. You have to be here. And I don't know. Well, I do now. I now know where that came from. I didn't at the time, but it was. Yeah, I just knew I had to be there, and actually wanted to be there, because again, I was just willing to do anything it took. And I suppose my healing, if you like, because I believe it is about healing. For me, it wasn't. For me, and I speak for myself, it predominantly is not a physical issue. And you touched on that a little bit a minute ago. It's a spiritual malady, and it's like, great, but how do you if you sort of start to understand, and I guess I only started to understand that by being part of this fellowship and hearing people share their experience and their brokenness and the harm they'd caused themselves and others, but also equally hearing the common solution that they'd come together and gone for a certain process, is probably the best word for it, but it's not the right word, I suppose. But there's a 12-step program, and being part of a fellowship where they're all rooting for the same thing. They're all doesn't matter where you came from, what you've done, whatever, because you turn up there feeling like a piece of what's it on the bottom of a shoe, you know, the lowest shoe in the lowest world sort of thing, and you're kind of, you just, I guess you don't feel alone anymore either. You're like, wow. I thought to that point I was the only person who did all that stuff and behaved that way, and so that was really, if I'm to be honest, the change, the healing started happening when I immersed myself into that process of the 12 steps with a person they called a sponsor, who's a man who had experience of the 12 steps. So he guided me through it. He was a man I asked, despite myself, I probably shouldn't have asked him. He was quite stern. He was a little bit like my dad. And like the sort of sensible part of my head shouldn't have asked him. I'd have preferred a woman, do you know what I mean? Because that goes back to that childhood thing. And but I asked this man, and he didn't mess about. He was really down the line. It wasn't like authoritarian or anything, but he was very honest, is the thing. That was the thing. And I thought honesty is a great healer. You know, truth will set you free, and that's totally been my experience all the way through all this, looking back on it. So I embarked on the 12 steps with this man, and it started to feel differently. You know, I started to feel, that's the only way to describe it really. I started to feel more complete. Yeah.
When you were having your 12-step sponsorship meetings, was it through that where this spiritual element came in, or this understanding and awareness of God? Did you have an awareness of God before entering into 12 steps, or not really? That's a
really good question. I think with the spiritual journey has been, it's almost like when I experience, how do I word this? Like the spiritual life, if you like. If I feel the spirit flowing, if I feel, it's like a place that it's almost like it's not the first time I've felt that. It's like it's a recognition, like a remembering of it. So it's not like, it's a weird thing to try and explain. It's almost like a familiarity. Like, I know this place. Maybe it is new, but it's like I've sensed it before. So I don't know if I can answer that question fully.
That's all right.
You know what I mean? But I didn't grow up in I say that, my grandparents were Salvation Army, and my mum, you know, is a faithful lady in a sense, but it was certainly, God wasn't a thing. We never went to church. We didn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't a topic around the table.
Yeah.
But I think it was, for me, it's the fuel that carried my recovery, and I started to experience that in fellowship through that stuff we talked about, through truth being spoken, through love being shown by people in fellowship, for acceptance, through you kind of like it's a sort of a forgivenessy type things, like just come in, sit down, like it doesn't matter what you've done, just come and start to be who you are or you're supposed to be.
Wow.
It's like an invitation
It's
to
an incredible program, isn't it?
Oh, it is, yeah. It's mind-blowing.
To offer that to people. And I mean, I know that many people find recovery through going to 12 steps.
Yeah.
So there's definitely something special about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what are you doing now then? So
what am I doing now?
Yeah, you've how long have you been in sobriety for? Or,
so I'll be 22 and a half years.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And
really cool.
Yeah, thank you. It's genuinely like being given a new life. It really is. And although I didn't realise it at the time back then, not only was I being set on a recovery journey, I was also being set on a faith journey as well. And that's been something that's really evolved and grown and I've taken different directions and everything, but I believe I've settled in now what my path is in that, and what I believe to be, not even believe actually, goes beyond belief, sort of know to be true. And so it's been a slow, sometimes there's a phrase in fellowship, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, and some of it's been really slow. And but I have to say that as much as alcoholism or addiction was a progressively downward trajectory. Recovery, there's certain things there's certain sort of action you put into that. It's not a passive exercise, and exercise is a rubbish word, but
it's a journey of passive, taking those actions and steps.
That's
you can't
it.
just
Thank
say,
you.
"Oh, I'll get better."
Don't just sit back and
be conscious about it.
That's it. Yeah.
I guess as well, it's because, as you've explained, your journey in alcohol addiction, you were quite unconscious.
Yes.
Towards
totally,
life and towards yourself.
Totally.
So it's learning, to come into reality, isn't it?
Yeah.
And to be conscious of your choices and the trajectory that one wants to take.
Yeah, totally.
So,
and there's a really, what you've reminded me of, a really, I see. So step one of the 12 steps is we were powerless over alcohol. No lives are imaginable. But step 12 talks about, it says, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. And to me, that is exactly what you just said. It's like that the powerlessness and unmanageability speaks of that. It was death, really. It's like you're not alive. You're just existing to use, drink, do whatever you're doing, hide, run. Yet step 12, you become awake. You become alive. You've done sufficient kind of work on yourself. You've taken certain actions. You've gone through a certain process, and you come to a place where you're alive. You're awake, and then you actually start. You have choices then, because you have an awareness about which has its trip ups and hazards as well. Because it's dealing with reality is not easy all the time. So I think that it's about that, being alive. And then it's almost like, I think I didn't get sobered up just to be not drinking. It was almost like God had a mission going on, and I certainly know that getting alongside other men in recovery was that, and is that still, and is a huge part of that still. Accompanying other guys who had similar experiences and being part of that healing journey and walking with them. Literally walk. It's not about. I never tell anyone what they should do. I say, this is what I did. This was my experience. If you want to come along for that, then you might want to think about that sort of thing. And so it's very non-prescriptive, but it's suggestive, and what it does is it places the responsibility of that person's recovery on them.
Yes.
Like, this is your gig, this is your journey. If I have to tell you what to do or anything like that, it's not coming from you. It's not your
well, they're still
healing.
not
Doesn't
taking
happen.
responsibility.
No,
for
exactly,
that, so,
correct. Yeah, and that's what I had to do. And in some areas of my life, it's taken me a long time to come to those places. Like 15, 20 odd years before I've got a handle on some things.
That's actually really encouraging, because I think sometimes in this culture we expect quick changes, everything so fast. But to actually have that patience with yourself and to realise, it takes a long time to get things done properly when we're dealing with human beings and our souls. So
you're
complex.
Right. I think the spiritual journey is certainly like that as well. And it's that adage that anything that comes quick can go quick, and anything that you spend time nurturing and developing and has much more of a chance of being embedded in who you are and what you're doing, and you know what I mean. So small incremental changes are often way more effective, but the human mind often we want the result, don't we? I want to be there now, but I'm actually not. Am I prepared to do all those little bits? And I fall into that trap all the time with many things, and I've learned that the hard way. But that I think being loving, I think, has been the key. Not just to others, but to self as well. Learn to go easy on myself and learn to accept who I am. Learn to accept that sensitivity as part of who I am. And actually, one of my biggest assets, when working with other men, when they hear me say, like, I'm frightened, that scared me. I was frightened of my father. I was frightened of this. I'm super sensitive. The amount of times guys just go, oh, thank goodness. You know what I mean?
Not alone in feeling sensitive as a man.
I wanted to say that all my life, and I haven't been able to. And that stuff, that bringing out truth, that's why I say the truth sets you free. That truth of who you are, you're honouring that truth, and the truth is healing. It's. And
that's so beautiful as well. How the very thing that you were trying to run away from, the sensitivity, has become just such a strength in your life, as well as giving that to other men.
Absolutely,
really cool. Really, really cool.
And I think it really informs most things I do. I feel particularly led by the spirit, if you like, and I feel that sensitivity is a real connection to that spirit, as it allows me to almost, I'm not going to say communicate with it, but I'm quite a spirit-led being, if you like, and I get nudges and I get all this stuff, and perhaps if I wasn't so sensitive, I might not be so open to that and a channel and receptive. So
and a good example for men to embrace their sensitivity. Yeah,
absolutely. I think there's space, the space for everyone, right, on this planet. There's room for everyone, and embrace it and be. I think the key is to be honest about it, just to find a place where you can be, whether that is an addiction or not, wherever that might be. And you're seeing these, it's really encouraging to see on Facebook these like men's club popping up and Andy's talk club and all this stuff, and men's shed, and guys just getting together and chatting and getting real, I guess, is the key. Like get real, and I absolutely, that's so where my heart is, not just with the addiction, but about, and seeing people step into who they're supposed to be, and because until you acknowledge that stuff, I believe, and get through that stuff, you're never going to you're always trying to fulfill it on a false premise. It's not real. It's not who you are. It's an expectation, or whether that's self-imposed or other imposed. It's always it's not the reality of who you are. And I think that's for me, that's what God, when you start to understand who you are in God's eyes and you're calling into that, I think for me that's when you become truly alive. Not just, and this might sound a bit weird, but not necessarily even just in a physical form, but in a spiritual way, where you're connected, well,
like you said, with the 12th step, that you gain that spiritual awakening. So
absolutely.
And so tell us briefly about your work in Africa, because I think that's such a cool little story. If you could give us the highlights of that.
Well, I've been involved in many like amazing things and setups and stuff. I do men's retreats and I do my own little podcast and blah blah blah, and it's just been great. But recently, two and a bit years ago, I travelled out to Africa with a dear friend of mine, and we met a chap out there. To Zambia, and we were we were out doing some community-based work. Really, they're guys they're champions in working with communities and encouraging healing in places. It was, my pals worked out in the late 80s in Zambia during the AIDS epidemic down there, and saw a lot of darkness and death and literally all happening. And my friend was running a Salvation Army mission hospital down there, and he saw what was happening around him. He saw just the chaos, and he identified a way of getting into neighbourhoods and homes and starting to have conversations with people, bringing people together. Essentially, literally, it's not much more difficult than that. Actually, getting people together in a safe, kind of nurtured way, and encouraging conversation to ask people where they're at. It's a bit like not necessarily like a rock bottom, but like, where are you now? Where are you? What's happening right here, right now? And people getting honest with where they're at. And cut a long story short, I met these guys about 15, 16 years ago now. I set up a fellowship group in a Salvation Army building in Woking. I met this couple who has since become dear friends, and I've got we've shared many stories. They love the addiction recovery story, and I love the story of their lives and their faith-filled lives and the mission that they've lived out. And so my sort of dream came true when I was invited to go on a trip to Zambia with Ian, and we went out and met Elvis down in Zambia. And so anyway, so as you can imagine, we're into all sorts of community stuff, and we're meeting people, and we went to the hospital, but we had a day off, and we went out into Lochinvar National Park, which is essentially, it's a wildlife park, but essentially it's bird life mostly. And we went out to this park, but unfortunately, there's a mine has been planted in the middle of this national park, which is something to do with some election campaign that was bankrolled, and the mine was blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go too into it. Yeah. But this mine's there, and it scared most of the birds off. So the birds are kind of gone. And the guide who we were with, who is a local guy, Mark, he decided to take us right out to this dear little school, which is basically squatting in the buildings of the fisheries department of Zambia. So they're dilapidated, falling down buildings. The classroom's made up of, it's just got a dirt floor with some chairs and tables, and we rocked up at this place, and some of these young children had never seen someone like me before, and they were running around screaming and running away from me, and it all sort of settled down. And once it settled down, these children were just joyful. I was like almost in tears. It was really emotional, that moment. And just to like, and at moments like that, I flick back to who I was, and then I come to a moment like that, I'm like, wow, do you know what I mean? That is just, it's mind blowing. Wow. And so we had a lovely bit of time with these children and the teachers, and met the headmistress or the lady who created the school 20 years ago. And some of a percentage of the children, about 60 of the children, actually board at the school, so they stay at the school. So
but it's not a proper house.
No.
It's still, okay.
No. It has a roof and stuff like that, but it's a dirt floor.
Okay.
And a lot of the children, so the girls were clearing away the classroom by night and sleeping on the floor of the classroom, and the boys were sleeping in this other very dilapidated building round the corner. And there was sort of like 25 boys in this room, and so it was just terrible conditions for these youngsters. And their lady there, Ruth, the headmistress, we had a conversation. She said her dream was to have dormitories built for these children. And we took our addiction story with us. That was what I did at that time, and not being shy to share that wherever we kind of went, and which it kind of happens anyway, right? Mm-hmm. It's sort of one of them things that you end up getting into. And so the whole kind of why we're there, the giving back, a kind of purpose-led life, if you like, all that sort of stuff. And we came back to England, and 18 months went by, and that conversation wouldn't leave me. I was just like, we've got to be able to do something about those dormitories. So I sat down with Ian one day and I said, what do you think? Do you think we could do something? And he's a great man. He just said, why not? Do it. He said, let's do it. And so we formed an association of people and guysmen, and we started fundraising. We started putting some events on and blah, blah, blah. And Yeah, we did. We've done amazing, and we've got the first dormitory built, with the second one just about to go into process. But
and is that a charity, something set up?
It's just about to become a charity.
And
yeah.
what's that going to be called?
It's Many Hands. It's called Many Hands Community Building.
I'll make sure I can put like a link in
Yeah,
the
thank you.
Okay.
But the gold of this, that is just amazing, that in itself. But the real gold in what we've done is we've taken our addiction story with us, and two friends of mine came with me back in April last year, and we went out and started to lay some foundations about not just the building, but as soon as we were out there, we got invited to go and speak with some different people around our addiction story, because they'd heard about this, and it was almost like we were pulled to these different places that they just wanted to hear our story. And so us guys, we obviously went to the school, but we started engaging there's a place called Holy Family Rehabilitation Centre. It's a brand new rehabilitation centre in Monzi, down in the southern province of Zambia, which is not too far from the school. Well, say too far, it's about 2.5 hours. And this chap, Brother Innocence, wanted to set up an alcohol rehabilitation. He already worked with children with limbs missing, and he'd made, I can't remember what you call them now, prosthetic. Yeah, but mostly out of wood and stuff. And they're one of the very few clinics in Zambia that does it, and they look after children with cerebral palsy as well. Again, one of the only clinics. So he wanted to look at how to best support people with addiction. So we literally went and spent a day with them, and we went and shared our experience. We went and talked about how we found recovery, literally a bit like we chatted today. And in front of a kind of room full of people, there were school teachers and people from different churches and all this sort of thing present. And something like germinated around that. It was all of a sudden, on the next trip, we were getting calls from the Salvation Army to go and join them on things. And so the recovery, I don't want to say agenda, but the recovery story and the recovery process, we're now linking in with the children at the school. We want to educate the kids around addiction and recovery. So I should say that part of that is also engaging in community, much like Ian did back in the 80s during the AIDS epidemic. It's about getting out, getting into neighbourhoods, getting into homes, right out into tribal settings where we're going out, and the children that lodge at the school are from the Twa community. Now they're 40-50 kilometres away on the Kafui Flats, which is a big sort of fishing area, and they live on what they call the islands. They used to live on the water, but the government made them get on the land, but they still live on the island, so they're surrounded by so these kids we drive there. It takes us a full day to drive there, spend an hour there, and to get back it takes a full, and it's dark when we leave and dark when we get back. So it's a real mission. And so these kids can't walk that every day. They have to, so they come and spend 3 months at a time. And we found we found quite a sad cycle of what the guys who the schooling there. So sorry, I'm losing track a little bit here. So predominantly the dorms are for the children of the Twa communities who can't travel home, need somewhere safe to sleep. But as we're doing this, we engaged with the Twa community. So we travelled out to visit the islands, visit the families, and one of the first things we identified was addiction and alcoholism with the fishermen. The fishermen they've got little bottles of vodka tucked in their boots. There's drug addiction. There, unfortunately, is prostitution with the young ladies. There's a cycle of people that get education, and then there's nowhere for that to move on to. So there's very little money. The parents don't have money to send their children to further education, to college, because it involves somewhere to stay. All this. So our question was, when we went there last, we sort of found this in the summer, and then when we went there last, when we September last year, was to get alongside, to actually go out and speak to the families about where you're at. Literally to say, and where are you at now? What are your hopes for the future? How can we support you in any way?
Thank you so much for sharing all that.
That's all right.
Sounds like an incredible journey from start right to where you are now. If you had to give just one simple piece of encouragement to someone listening who's maybe in the throes of addiction, what would you want to say to them?
Wow, my goodness. Trust. I think trust. It's so easy to say don't be afraid, because I think it's all rooted in fear, but trust that there is better, and that healing can happen no matter where you're at. You know, I believe that God heals anything, but you don't have to do it on your own.
Awesome.
You know.
John, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, pleasure. Yeah, absolute pleasure. Thank you. Lovely.